It was supposed to be just another ordinary day in the quiet suburban neighborhood. The sun was shining brightly, casting a warm glow over the neatly manicured lawns and pristine sidewalks. Birds chirped in the trees, and the faint hum of distant traffic was the only sound that pierced the calm. It felt like any other morning, the kind where the world seemed still, untouched by the chaos that sometimes lurks beneath the surface. In the front yard, my daughter, a bundle of energy, was running in circles, laughing with joy as her feet pounded against the soft grass. Her giggles echoed through the stillness, a sound so pure, so carefree, that it seemed to capture everything beautiful about childhood. She had always been the light of our lives, her energy infectious, her laughter the soundtrack of our home. But in that moment, as she played, there was something different in the air, something unseen, a presence lurking at the edge of this peaceful world. Across the street, a figure stood in the shadow of a large oak tree. They watched intently, their eyes fixed on my daughter with an unsettling intensity. There was no reason for them to be there, no reason for anyone to be watching. This was a neighborhood built on rules, a place where everyone was expected to conform, to maintain appearances. The HOA had set its boundaries long ago, dictating how lawns should look, how cars should be parked, how lives should be lived. But what was supposed to be a safe, regulated environment was beginning to feel more like a trap, with eyes always watching, always judging. I had always trusted the HOA, believing that it existed to maintain peace and harmony in our little corner of the world. But in that moment, I felt a chill, an unease creeping into my bones. I had heard the whispers, the complaints about Karen, the enforcer of the rules, the one who took the HOA's power to heart and wasn't afraid to make sure everyone followed the letter of the law. But I never imagined her influence would reach our doorstep. My daughter, so innocent and carefree, didn't understand the danger that was slowly encroaching upon our lives. She simply saw a space to run, to play, to be free. Little did we know, the game was about to change, and not in a way any of us could have ever expected. The sound of my daughter's laughter filled the air as she raced around the front yard, her tiny legs moving in rapid bursts of energy. It was a beautiful, warm afternoon, the kind that seemed to stretch on forever, allowing for moments of innocence and freedom. Her favorite spot was the patch of grass near the oak tree, a place where she would often pretend to be a superhero, zooming past invisible enemies, her hair flying behind her like a cape. In that moment, nothing in the world seemed more important than her joy, and I stood on the porch, watching her with a smile, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't known in a long time. But as I glanced over my shoulder toward the street, I noticed something strange. Across the road, a figure stood watching from behind the fence, her eyes fixed on my daughter's every move. At first, I thought it was just a neighbor or perhaps someone walking by, but then the reality set in. Karen, the HOA representative. Her face was impassive, her posture stiff, almost as if she were studying the scene, waiting for something to happen. I had seen her many times before, walking around the neighborhood with her clipboard, making sure every lawn was cut to perfection and that every rule was being adhered to. But today, there was something different about her. The way she stood there, so rigid, so focused, felt like an intrusion on our peaceful moment. I felt a flicker of unease deep inside. My daughter was just playing, something any child would do, but Karen was still watching. The longer I stood there, the more I could feel the tension building, an undercurrent of discomfort that slowly began to fill the air. I tried to shake it off, thinking that maybe I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't ignore the way Karen's eyes never left my daughter. Moments later, the silence of the street was broken by the sound of Karen's sharp heels tapping against the sidewalk. She was walking directly toward us now, her stern expression never wavering. My heart began to race as I saw her approach, her figure cutting through the distance with deliberate precision. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice firm, carrying an edge I hadn't heard before. My daughter, still caught up in her own little world, didn't hear her at first, continuing to run around in wild abandon. "Excuse me," Karen repeated, this time louder, more commanding. My daughter paused, her eyes widening slightly at the sudden interruption, and I could see the confusion flicker across her face. She stood frozen in place, unsure of what was happening, until Karen's voice came again, harsh and pointed. "You're not supposed to be running around in the yard like that," Karen said, her eyes narrowing. "There are rules in this neighborhood, and you're violating them." My daughter looked up at me, then back at Karen, a mix of confusion and fear creeping across her innocent face. "I'm just playing," she said softly, her voice small, hesitant. "Rules are rules," Karen snapped, crossing her arms over her chest. "You can't just do whatever you want. The HOA has specific guidelines about how yards should be used. You're disturbing the peace." I felt a wave of anger rise within me. How could someone be so callous, so rigid, over something so innocent? My daughter wasn't breaking any serious law. She wasn't harming anyone, wasn't being reckless, wasn't doing anything but running in our own front yard. And yet here was Karen, acting like a dictator, enforcing her idea of order with no consideration for what mattered most, the happiness of a child. "Karen, she's just playing," I said, my voice strained but steady, hoping to defuse the situation before it escalated further. "She's not doing anything wrong." But Karen wasn't listening. Her gaze didn't soften, didn't shift even slightly. "The rules are there for a reason," she said, her voice colder now, as if she had already made up her mind. "I'll be reporting this to the HOA. And if it continues, there will be consequences. We can't have people thinking they're above the rules." Her words hung in the air like a heavy weight. My daughter looked at me again, her eyes wide, her small face now filled with uncertainty. It broke my heart to see her so frightened over something so simple. She had no understanding of what the HOA even was, let alone why Karen was so angry about her running around in her own yard. To her, it was just another game, another moment to enjoy, but Karen had somehow turned it into a matter of control. "I'm sorry," my daughter whispered, stepping back as if trying to make herself smaller, hoping to disappear from Karen's gaze. I could feel the rage building inside me. This wasn't just about the yard. This wasn't about rules or policies. It was about power, Karen's power over us, her ability to dictate our lives, our joy, our freedom. And for the first time, I realized something deeper. This wasn't going to be a one-time confrontation. No, this was just the beginning. Karen wasn't simply enforcing rules. She was taking pleasure in the control she had over others, in the way she could make people feel small, insignificant, as though their lives were not their own to lead. As Karen turned and walked away, there was a palpable sense of unease that hung in the air. The encounter, though brief, had left a lasting mark. My daughter, still visibly shaken, returned to her spot in the yard, but no longer with the same carefree energy. Her laughter had faded, replaced by a somber quiet as she stood, unsure of herself. I could feel her need to ask, to understand, to make sense of what had just happened. But I didn't have the answers. All I knew was that something in our world had shifted, and the worst part was that I wasn't sure if we were ready for what was to come next. And as Karen walked back to her house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't over. The tension in the air seemed to thicken, like the calm before a storm. There was a dark edge to everything now, a sense that this encounter had only scratched the surface of something much more dangerous, something I wasn't prepared for, but knew I would have to face. The days following that confrontation with Karen felt heavier with each passing moment. At first, I tried to brush it off, convinced that it was just a misunderstanding. After all, she was just enforcing the rules, right? But deep down, I knew that something wasn't right. The way Karen had spoken to my daughter, the coldness in her eyes, the way she had stepped into our lives with such a sense of authority, it left a mark that I couldn't ignore. I told myself it was a small matter, that we would move on and forget about it. But Karen, it seemed, wasn't going to let that happen. It started with little things, her watching us from across the street, her car parked at odd hours just outside our window, her gaze unwavering. I'd catch her sometimes standing at the edge of our yard, eyes fixed on the house, waiting for any sign that we were breaking another one of her rules. It was unsettling, but I told myself it was just coincidence. She had a job to do, and maybe she was just doing it a little too zealously. But as the days turned into weeks, Karen's presence began to feel like an ever looming shadow hanging over us. It wasn't just that she was watching us, it was the way she did it. Her stare was sharp, penetrating, as if she were looking for any reason to turn the neighborhood against us. Her presence felt invasive, like a constant reminder that we weren't allowed to exist without her approval. I began to wonder if she was trying to provoke us into doing something that could give her the excuse to escalate things further. I tried to talk to her, to get her to see reason. One afternoon, I approached her as she stood across the street, staring at our house. I forced a smile, tried to remain civil. Karen, can we talk for a moment? I asked, my voice a little more strained than I intended. I understand the rules, but you're making my daughter anxious. She's just a kid. Karen turned toward me, her face impassive, the same coldness in her eyes that I had seen before. I'm just doing my job, she replied flatly. If you can't follow the rules, you'll face the consequences. It's that simple. I tried to reason with her, but the conversation went nowhere. Her words were final, her stance unyielding. And as the days went on, her aggression became more apparent. She wasn't just following the rules anymore, she was making it personal. I started to hear her whispering to other neighbors, spreading rumors about us, making us look like the troublemakers in the neighborhood. Her influence was insidious, creeping into the conversations of those around us. Some neighbors who had always been friendly began to distance themselves from us, refusing to acknowledge us when we passed by. Others, who had once been sympathetic, began to echo Karen's words, parroting her complaints as though they had become their own. It was as though Karen's toxic influence had spread, and we were left standing alone in a community that once felt like home. The tension in the house was palpable. My daughter, once so full of life and laughter, became withdrawn, afraid to go outside. She'd ask me why Karen was always watching, why she was always so angry. I tried to reassure her, but the truth was I didn't have answers. I didn't know why Karen had chosen to target us, why she had decided that we weren't worthy of the same peace and safety as everyone else. All I knew was that her presence was slowly poisoning everything around us. One evening, things took a dark turn. I had just finished dinner when I noticed a car parked in front of our house, headlights on, engine running. I glanced out the window and saw Karen sitting in the driver's seat, staring at the house. She wasn't moving, just sitting there in the darkness. My stomach turned as I watched her, the unsettling feeling growing deeper. It was late, too late for anyone to be out there unless they had a reason. And as the minutes ticked by, I could feel the weight of her gaze pressing down on us. I didn't want to let her see that we were intimidated, but I couldn't help it. There was something about her presence that felt like a threat, like she was waiting for us to slip up, waiting for us to make one mistake that would give her the power to tear us apart. The following days were filled with more of the same. Karen's behavior became more erratic, more aggressive. She started making threats, telling us that if we didn't comply with the rules, she would report us to the HOA, to the police, or even to the legal authorities. She seemed to think that her position gave her the right to control every aspect of our lives, and I could see the way her words were slowly eating away at our peace of mind. It wasn't just the rules anymore, it was a power struggle, and she was determined to win. There was a moment late one night when things reached a breaking point. I had just put my daughter to bed and was sitting on the couch trying to distract myself from the mounting pressure. That's when I saw it. Karen's car, once again, parked outside just beyond the yard. I watched her through the window as she sat there, staring at our house in the dead of night. This time, it wasn't just unsettling, it was downright terrifying. I couldn't escape the feeling that she was watching us, waiting for something, perhaps even hoping for a reason to make her next move. I couldn't shake the thought that she wasn't just a neighbor anymore, she was a constant threat. I felt helpless, trapped. We had nowhere to turn. The HOA was supposed to be there to help maintain peace, not to destroy lives. But with Karen's growing influence, it felt as though the very people who were supposed to keep us safe were the ones making us feel like prisoners in our own home. The isolation began to sink in, and I could feel my family pulling away from everyone, retreating into ourselves for fear of what Karen might do next. What started as a simple confrontation had morphed into a battle for control. And in the quiet of the night, as I watched Karen sitting outside, I realized that there was no turning back. This wasn't about rules or community, it was about power. And Karen wasn't going to stop until she had taken everything from us. The family was on the edge, uncertain of what would come next, but knowing with growing certainty that things were only going to escalate from here. The tension had reached a boiling point. For weeks, Karen had made her presence known, lurking in the background, silently observing every move we made, waiting for any opportunity to tighten her grip on our lives. The confrontations had become more frequent, more intense, and the weight of her gaze felt like an ever-present shadow over our family. It was no longer just about rules or yard work. It was about control, about power, and Karen was determined to take it all. That morning, the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. My daughter, despite everything, was outside again. She was hesitant at first, unsure if the coast was clear, but eventually the pull of the open space, the desire to feel free once more, outweighed her fear. She started running again, her small legs carrying her across the yard in the same carefree way she had before all of this started. She laughed, that sweet, innocent laugh that seemed to be a stark contrast to the dark cloud that had settled over our home. But today was different. As I stood in the window, watching her, I saw it, the unmistakable figure of Karen walking briskly toward our front yard. Her movements were deliberate, her face a mask of fury. There was no greeting this time, no attempt at civility. Karen's approach was cold, calculated, her footsteps heavy with purpose. I felt a lump form in my throat as I realized that today would not be like the others. My daughter froze as Karen came closer, her eyes widening with a mix of confusion and fear. She knew, just as I did, that something was terribly wrong. Karen was no longer just the enforcer of neighborhood rules. She was a woman driven by rage, by the desire to control, to make us pay for defying her. "Hey, you!" Karen's voice rang out sharply, like a whip cracking through the air. "What do you think you're doing?" My daughter's face flushed, but she stood her ground, her small shoulders squared as she faced the woman who had made her life a waking nightmare. "I'm just playing," she replied softly, her voice trembling but defiant. "Not in my neighborhood, you're not." Karen snapped, taking another step forward, her eyes narrowed. "You think you can just break the rules, run wild in your yard, and no one will say anything? You're wrong." I could feel the tension rising, the suffocating grip of fear clutching at my chest. I rushed outside, trying to intervene before things escalated further. "Karen, stop!" I called, my voice strained with desperation. "She's just a child. Let her be." But Karen wasn't listening. She didn't care about my pleas, didn't care about my daughter's innocence. Her eyes were filled with an icy, unyielding rage, her face twisted with frustration and a growing sense of superiority. She had already decided that this was her moment, her chance to make an example out of us. "You need to teach your daughter some respect," Karen sneered. Taking another step closer, her words like daggers. "You people think you're above the law, but I'm going to make sure everyone knows who's in charge around here." I stepped forward, trying to protect my daughter, trying to put myself between her and the woman who seemed determined to break us. "Karen, that's enough," I said, my voice shaking with a mix of anger and fear. "You can't just bully us like this. It's a game to her, for God's sake." But Karen wasn't finished. She reached into her bag, pulling out something I hadn't expected, a gun. My breath caught in my throat as I saw the cold steel glint in the sunlight. My mind raced, my heart pounding in my chest. "You think I'm bluffing?" Karen hissed, her grip on the gun tightening. "You think I won't do it? You've pushed me too far." I could barely comprehend what was happening. The world seemed to slow down as the reality of the situation hit me. Karen wasn't just a woman standing in our yard anymore, she had become a threat. The gun in her hand was no longer a symbol of power, it was the embodiment of her madness, her need to control, her willingness to destroy everything we had built. No, I shouted, lunging forward in an attempt to disarm her, to stop this madness before it could go any further. But I was too late. In a blur of motion, Karen raised the gun, her finger tightening on the trigger. And then everything happened in an instant. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the air, sharp and deafening. My daughter's scream pierced the silence, the sound of pure terror, pure pain. I turned just in time to see her fall to the ground, her body crumpling as if the life had been drained out of her in that single horrifying moment. The world seemed to crumble around me. My heart stopped, my breath frozen in my chest. No, I cried, rushing to her side, falling to my knees. No, please, please, God, no. My daughter lay there, her small frame trembling, her hand pressed against her side where the blood seeped through her fingers, her wide, terrified eyes locked onto mine, pleading for help. The air was thick with the scent of gunpowder, and everything seemed to blur together. The distant sound of Karen's heavy breathing, the frantic beat of my own heart, the quiet, desperate cries for my daughter. I could feel the coldness of the pavement beneath me, but it didn't matter. Nothing mattered except her. I took her hand in mine, my own body trembling as I tried to comfort her, as I tried to make her understand that everything would be okay, but the words stuck in my throat. There was no way to fix this. There was no way to take away the pain, the fear, the horror. Karen stood a few feet away, her eyes vacant, her expression unreadable. The gun hung loosely in her hand, as if she hadn't even realized what she had just done. My mind screamed at her, but my voice was caught in my throat. I couldn't look at her. I couldn't fathom the reality of what had just happened. Help her. I choked out, the words barely escaping my lips. Please help her. But Karen didn't move. She just stood there, her face blank, as though she were watching a scene unfold on television, detached from any of the suffering around her. It wasn't until I screamed at her again that she finally took a step back, as though she were snapping out of some trance. The world was spinning. My daughter's blood stained my hands, and every breath I took felt like a knife in my chest. This wasn't just a mistake. This wasn't just an accident. Karen had crossed a line that couldn't be undone, and I couldn't even process it. My daughter was lying there, her life hanging in the balance, and all I could do was hold her, pray for help, and beg for the nightmare to end. But it wouldn't. Not yet. In that moment, the entire world shifted. It wasn't just a confrontation anymore. It was a nightmare, and we were trapped inside it. Was it an accident? Was it intentional? The question lingered in the air, unanswered. But in that moment, as my daughter fought to hold on, all that mattered was the pain of a parent watching their child suffer, and the overwhelming realization that the world they had once known would never be the same again. The police arrived within minutes, but to me, it felt like hours. My hands were still stained with my daughter's blood, my heart still pounding in my chest as I stood helplessly by her side. The world had shifted into a surreal haze, a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. My daughter lay in an ambulance, the paramedics working feverishly to stabilize her, and all I could do was stand there, numb, watching everything slip through my fingers. The officers quickly cordoned off the area, their stern faces making it clear that they had no understanding of the gravity of what had just happened. They took statements, gathered evidence, but the cold, bureaucratic process felt like an affront to the chaos we were living through. I wanted to scream at them, to demand they do something, anything to fix this, but instead, I found myself standing there, mute as they went through the motions. "Ma'am, can you describe what happened?" One officer asked, his tone detached, as if he were asking about a fender bender, not a child's life being torn apart. I glanced at Karen, standing at the edge of the yard, her arms crossed, her face emotionless. She didn't seem to understand what she had just done. Or maybe she did. Either way, I couldn't bring myself to look at her for too long. She was already talking to another officer, her words low and indistinct, but I could see the way they nodded at her, the way they seemed to give her the benefit of the doubt. I felt my blood boil. Karen had shot my daughter, and yet it seemed like the world was trying to paint her as the victim. The officers treated her with the kind of deference I'd only seen reserved for people of power. Her influence in the HOA, her status as the so-called enforcer of the neighborhood's rules, made it impossible to escape the reality of her reach. Even now, she was working her narrative, spinning her lies, and it felt as though no one was questioning her. The days that followed were a blur. The investigation dragged on, slowly suffocating any hope I had left. I spoke with the detectives, providing every detail I could remember, hoping that somehow, through the sheer weight of the truth, we could make Karen pay for what she had done. But with each passing day, the justice I was seeking seemed to slip further and further away. Karen had turned the entire neighborhood against us. People who had once greeted us with warm smiles now crossed the street to avoid us. Neighbors who had been friendly, who had once waved as we passed, now gave us cold stares. It was clear that Karen's influence in the HOA had become a powerful tool to turn the community against us. She had painted us as the troublemakers, the ones who couldn't follow simple rules, and now everyone seemed to believe it. Some neighbors, who had once shown concern for my daughter, now avoided us like we were toxic. They whispered behind closed doors, passing judgment without ever taking the time to understand the truth. Meanwhile, Karen's supporters rallied behind her, standing by her claims that everything had been done according to the rules, that she had merely been enforcing the law. She portrayed herself as the victim, as someone who had been forced into a corner by our defiance. And the more she spoke, the more people began to buy into her version of events. It was maddening. It felt as though we were fighting not just for justice, but for our very reputations, our dignity. The more I fought, the more the world seemed to close in on us. I could see the looks from neighbors, the quiet whispers behind closed windows. My daughter was still in the hospital fighting for her life, and yet it felt like I was the one being punished. My every move, my every word, scrutinized under the weight of Karen's carefully crafted story. The police investigation didn't help. Every time I spoke to them, it felt as though they were listening to Karen's side more intently than mine. Her words carried weight, the HOA's support, her so-called good standing in the community, while my story seemed to fade into the background. The police officer I spoke to seemed more interested in making sure the neighborhood stayed peaceful than in actually uncovering the truth. It was then that I realized how deep Karen's control ran. It wasn't just about the HOA or the rules. It was about the power she held over this community, over the people who were supposed to be my neighbors. She had become the puppet master, pulling the strings, manipulating everyone around her, including the police. There was a moment when I truly feared she might get away with it. The longer the investigation stretched on, the more it seemed like nothing would come of it. I sat in our living room, staring at the empty chair where my daughter had once sat, her laughter now nothing but a distant memory, and wondered if we were ever going to see justice. Would Karen really be able to escape this? Would she really walk away from the horror she had caused, her hands clean while my daughter lay fighting for her life? The thought made my stomach twist, but in the quiet desperation of that moment, something inside me snapped. I couldn't let her win. I couldn't let this injustice stand. I would fight for my daughter, for the truth, no matter how impossible it seemed. Even if the entire community turned against us, even if Karen's supporters grew in number, I would make sure she paid for what she had done. And so, the fight for justice became not just about the law, it became a battle for our lives, our family, and everything we had lost. I would not let Karen's lies become the reality everyone believed. No matter how long it took, no matter the cost, I would make sure that the truth was heard, and that, somehow, justice would prevail. The investigation had stalled. Days turned into weeks, and despite our best efforts to expose Karen for what she truly was, a woman who had crossed the line from rule enforcer to malicious aggressor, it seemed like the world was too busy moving on. The police were no closer to bringing her to justice, and the community had already embraced her narrative, painting us as the instigators. But something in the pit of my stomach told me that there was more to Karen's story than just a power-hungry HOA enforcer. One afternoon, while searching through some old paperwork in the attic, I stumbled across an envelope tucked away in a box labeled HOA. At first, it looked like just another pile of forgotten documents, but something made me stop and take a closer look. Inside the envelope was a series of old meeting minutes from HOA gatherings, newsletters, and memos. As I sifted through the papers, one name kept appearing: Karen. There was a strange sense of familiarity to the name, as though I had heard it before. But it wasn't until I found a letter from a former HOA president that the pieces started to fall into place. The letter, dated several years ago, was addressed to a group of community members, and it mentioned Karen in a way that caught my attention. It referred to a series of disputes between her and another family, our family to be exact. I felt my heart sink as I read on. The letter outlined a bitter conflict between Karen and my late husband, Mark. The story was something I had never heard before. Mark had been involved in a legal battle with the HOA back when we first moved into the neighborhood. It seemed like a small issue at the time, just a disagreement over property lines, but according to this letter, it had escalated far beyond that. Karen had been a vocal part of the HOA board during that time, and the letter suggested that her involvement in the case was more than just professional, it was personal. Apparently, Mark had once challenged the HOA's control over the neighborhood, questioning their authority to impose such strict rules. Karen, who had always been a staunch defender of the HOA's power, saw this as a personal affront. The letter hinted that Karen harbored resentment toward Mark for challenging the authority of the very institution she had helped build. It became clear that Karen didn't just want to win a legal battle, she wanted to destroy Mark's reputation, to make him and our family feel the full weight of her power. And she had succeeded. The case had been dismissed, but the damage to Mark's name and to our family's standing in the community was already done. As I read further, I discovered something even more chilling. The letter mentioned a secret agenda that Karen had been working toward within the HOA, a plan to tighten her grip on the neighborhood to ensure that she had full control over the lives of the people who live there. It wasn't just about enforcing rules, it was about creating a system where she was the ultimate authority, above reproach, untouchable. And that system, it seemed, had been put into place slowly, piece by piece, using fear, manipulation, and intimidation. I sat there for what felt like hours, the weight of this new revelation settling over me like a cold blanket. Karen had been planning this all along. Her actions against our family were not just some random outburst. They were part of a larger, carefully calculated effort to destroy anyone who dared challenge her power. My daughter, my family, none of it had ever been about rules or safety. It had all been about Karen's need to control, to break anyone who stood in her way. I knew then that we were up against something far bigger than we had imagined. Karen wasn't just a rogue HOA enforcer. She was the mastermind behind a corrupt system, one that she had crafted to ensure her absolute control over the neighborhood. The community was unaware of the true extent of her influence, and the more I uncovered, the more I realized how deep the conspiracy ran. Neighbors who had once seemed innocent were now part of her network, working together to maintain the status quo. Karen wasn't just a villain in our story, she was the puppet master, pulling the strings behind every smile, every conversation, every decision made in that neighborhood. As the truth unraveled before me, I understood that the fight for justice would be harder than I ever imagined. This was no longer just a battle between one family and an overzealous HOA representative. It was a fight to expose the corrupt system Karen had built and to reclaim our lives from the twisted hold she had on everything. But I wasn't about to let her win, not this time. It had been months since that fateful day, but the wounds, both physical and emotional, were still raw. My daughter had survived the shooting, but her recovery had been a slow and painful journey. The doctors said she was lucky to be alive, but luck didn't seem to offer much comfort when I saw her lying in that hospital bed, her small body scarred by an act of violence she would never fully understand. Her once carefree spirit was now clouded by fear, by the memory of Karen and what had been done to her. But despite everything, despite the darkness that had crept into our lives, I saw something in her every day, a spark, a determination to fight back, to reclaim her innocence. And so I fought alongside her. The decision to take action wasn't an easy one. The HOA had its claws so deep in the neighborhood, and Karen's influence stretched further than we had ever imagined. But we couldn't let her win. We couldn't allow her to tear apart everything we had worked so hard to build, not just for us, but for every family in that community who had been living in fear under the shadow of her control. We had to expose her for what she truly was, and we had to make sure she paid for what she had done. The first step was to take legal action. I found a lawyer who was willing to take on the case, someone who understood the complexities of HOA laws and was determined to see justice served. We filed a lawsuit against Karen, accusing her of assault, emotional distress, and abuse of power. It was a long and grueling process, filled with legal battles and setbacks, but it was a battle worth fighting. In the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Karen sat at the defendant's table, her face cold and defiant, as though she had nothing to fear. She had her lawyer, of course, someone who knew how to manipulate the system, how to twist the truth to fit her narrative. She claimed that the shooting had been an accident, that she had acted in self-defense, but her story was filled with holes, contradictions. As the trial unfolded, the truth began to unravel. We presented evidence, Karen's past actions as an HOA enforcer, the documents I had uncovered in the attic, the years of manipulation and control. We brought in neighbors who had seen Karen's behavior firsthand, who had witnessed her obsession with maintaining her hold over the neighborhood. But the most powerful testimony came from my daughter. She took the stand, her voice trembling as she spoke about the day she was shot, about the fear she felt and the confusion of being caught in the crossfire of someone else's rage. It wasn't easy for her. She was just a child, and the weight of recounting that traumatic experience was almost too much to bear. But as she spoke, I saw something in her eyes, a strength, a resilience that made me proud. She was no longer the frightened little girl who had been paralyzed by fear. She was reclaiming her power, her voice, and in that moment, I knew we were going to win. Karen's defense crumbled under the weight of the truth. The evidence was undeniable, and the witnesses who testified painted a picture of a woman who had abused her position of power to terrorize an entire community. The jury deliberated for hours, but in the end, they delivered a guilty verdict. Karen was held accountable for her actions. Finally, the relief was overwhelming, but it wasn't enough to erase the pain. It wasn't enough to fix everything Karen had broken. My daughter's recovery continued, though it would never be the same. The scars, both physical and emotional, would stay with her forever. But in the midst of the pain, there was healing. There was a sense of justice, a sense that the system could still work, that there was still hope for people who were willing to fight for what was right. As for the neighborhood, things began to change. The HOA, weakened by the exposure of Karen's corruption, lost much of its power. The other families who had been too afraid to stand up to Karen found their voices. We came together, united, determined to rebuild what had been destroyed. We fought for transparency, for fairness, for a community where everyone could feel safe, where no one had to live in fear of someone abusing their authority. And so, as we moved forward, I took solace in the fact that my daughter was no longer the victim of Karen's cruelty. She was a survivor. We all were. The fight had cost us more than we had ever imagined. It had cost us our sense of safety, our peace of mind, and for a time, even our belief in the goodness of others. But in the end, it gave us something even more precious, a sense of justice, a sense of hope that we could take back control of our lives. And in that small victory, we found the strength to heal, to rebuild, and to move forward. The road ahead would still be difficult. We would always carry the scars of what had happened. But we had fought for our right to live without fear, and we had won. And that, I realized, was worth everything. As I stand here, Recounting this journey, I can't help but think about everything we've lost. My daughter will never be the same. The innocence she had, so freely given to the world, was stolen in an instant. A moment of laughter, a moment of joy, turned into something that will haunt us forever. But through the darkness, something beautiful emerged. We fought for justice. We fought for a life that felt like it was slipping away. There are moments in life where you're faced with a choice, whether to stay silent to accept the injustice or to stand up no matter the cost and fight for what's right. We chose to fight, and it wasn't easy. It never is. But looking back, I know we did the right thing. My daughter, who was once terrified to step outside, is slowly learning how to live again, to laugh again, to run again. But the truth is, the fight doesn't end here. Karen's actions were a symptom of something much larger, a system built on fear, control, and power. So ask yourself, what would you do if you were in our shoes? How far would you go to protect what you love, to fight for what's right when the odds are stacked against you? How far would you go for justice? This isn't just our story. It's a story that belongs to everyone who's ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. And it's a reminder that sometimes we have to be the ones to stand up and say enough. Because when we do, when we fight for what's right, we don't just reclaim our lives, we change the world. And that, my friends, is the greatest victory of all. If you've been moved by this story, if it's made you think about the power of standing up for what's right, I invite you to join us on this journey. The HOA Stories isn't just about one family's battle. It's about the countless others out there fighting for their voices to be heard. Subscribe to the HOA Stories and stay tuned for more real stories, more truth, and more justice. Share this video with others who need to hear it. And together, let's continue to shine a light on the darkness. Your support means everything, and together, we can make a difference. Don't just be a spectator, be part of the change. Join us.